Scattered throughout most of Eastern and Western Europe are the remains of a once powerful empire. Crumbling and overgrown, yet hauntingly silent, these monumental structures that were built to last 1,000 years have now become the graveyard of a culture and ideology that ended with the death of the Third Reich. The beaches of Normandy, landing site of the greatest invasion force in history, where thousands of Canadian, British, and American troops stormed the 50-mile-long coastline of France, resulting in the liberation of Europe from the Nazis, but at a cost of life unsurpassed by any other war known to mankind. The story of D-Day began just before midnight on June 5, 1944, when Allied airborne divisions departed from their bases in England for the 90-mile trip across the Channel to the coast of Normandy. The plan, known as Operation Overlord, called for the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to drop just behind the American landing beaches, which would cut off enemy counterattacks, while at the same time units of the British 6th Airborne Division would take the Merville gun battery and the bridges at the Orne River and Caen Canal. Captured shortly after midnight on the morning of June 6 by Company D, 2nd Battalion Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, the bridges at Bénouville would prove to be vital in preventing German reinforcements from reaching the Allied invasion beaches. Renamed Pegasus in honor of the British 6th Airborne Division, the original structure seen here just before its removal in the fall of 1993 is now on display at the nearby Pegasus Museum. The old bridge, along with dozens of artifacts, chronicle the events which led to the first Allied objective seized on French soil. Incredibly, not only did it take the Brits 15 minutes to secure the structure after their gliders landed just a few feet away, but only one of the 3 sailplanes, known as a Horsa, suffered any damage on impact, which resulted in just 1 death. Today, the site where the gliders came to rest is marked by a series of small monuments which detail the heroic efforts of the British Airborne and the early morning events of June 6, 1944. Another nearby marker pays tribute to Major John Howard, commander of Company D, who led the capture of the Pegasus Bridge and held it until reinforcements arrived several hours later. The next objective for the British Airborne was the German gun battery at Merville, which the Allies believed posed a major threat to the British landing beaches. But when Lieutenant Colonel Otway and his Royal 9th Battalion captured the battery at 5 a.m. on the morning of June 6th, they found nothing more than a few outdated 75mm cannons situated in each of the concrete bunkers. But tragically, even though the battery was captured in less than 20 minutes, it still cost the lives of at least half of Otway's 150-member assault team. Meanwhile, in the village of Sainte-Marie-Église at the opposite end of the coast, things weren't going much better for the 82nd Airborne Division. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, several of the paratroopers were accidentally dropped directly into the town center, where the Germans began firing on the hapless Americans. But for Private John Steele, the event would prove to be his lucky day when his chute became snagged on the church steeple, where he dangled for a few hours before being rescued and taken prisoner. The resilient Steele managed to escape several days later, and his saga continues as one of the more fascinating chapters in the story of the first French town liberated by the Americans. It was shortly after dawn when hundreds of Allied troop carriers began approaching the various landing sites for the opening assault on the beaches of Normandy. Known as Operation Overlord, the assault called for the Brits to land on Sword Beach, the Canadians on Juno, the Brits on Gold, and the Americans, the largest of the Allied forces, on Omaha and Utah. But at Utah, things went wrong from the very start. As the approaching Allies neared the beach, they drifted away from their intended targets at sectors Terra Green and Uncle Red, which resulted in the first wave hitting the beach a half-mile south at Victor. It was here at 6:30 in the morning on June 6th that General Teddy Roosevelt Jr. and the men of the 8th Infantry 4th Division became the first Allied force to land on the beaches of Normandy. Today, the area known as Les Madeleines, where the assault sector Victor was once located, is littered with the relics of war and the reminders of the D-Day invasion. Dozens of battle artifacts and weapons like the 47mm anti-tank gun and the powerful 50mm tank cannon continue to remind visitors of the formidable German defenses that once lined these beaches. Allied armor like the Sherman M4 and the Alligator LVT amphibious troop carrier, as well as the LCVP landing craft, surround one of the most popular museums in northern France. The coast of Normandy is lined with hundreds of monuments in all shapes and sizes, like the impressive 1st Engineers Special Brigade Memorial in honor of the heroic men who lost their lives during the first several hours of the invasion. Situated on the top of a former German blockhouse, the huge reinforced concrete structure was used for several weeks by the Americans as brigade headquarters. About a half-mile north of the Utah Beach Museum is de les Dunes de Verville, where Teddy Roosevelt Jr. and his 4th Division was supposed to have come ashore prior to drifting off course and landing at Victor. It was here at Les Dunes that the first Allied armored transports, like the American M3 half-track and the French M8 light assault vehicle, rolled off the beach in the early morning hours of June 6th. The monument pays tribute to both the Allied invasion and General Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division, which arrived here in August 1944. At about the same time the U.S. 4th Division was storming Utah Beach, Colonel Rudder and his 2nd Rangers were rapidly approaching their objective at Pointe du Hoc. It was about 7 a.m., just 30 minutes after the assault on Utah Beach, that the Rangers began scaling the treacherous 100-foot cliffs under a constant barrage of enemy fire, which came from both a gun battery control bunker and along the entire ridge overlooking the beach. But despite the deadly conditions and overwhelming odds, it took just 30 minutes for the resilient Rangers to reach the top of the bluff and capture the German Army coastal gun battery. Devastated by Allied bombs just prior to D-Day, the Germans had managed to remove the giant 155mm guns to a secluded area just behind the battery, where they were later discovered by a Ranger patrol and destroyed. Today, the crumbling bunkers and casemates of Pointe du Hoc, along with the impressive granite monument situated on top of the fire control bunker, serves as an American battlefield national sanctuary. Dedicated to Colonel James E. Rudder and the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, the Granite Memorial reminds visitors of the almost 200 men who were either captured, killed, or wounded during the Ranger assault on Pointe du Hoc. Meanwhile, a few miles down the coast, U.S. combat units were coming under heavy fire as they were storming the shores of Omaha Beach. Stretching 6 miles along the Normandy coast, the assault sectors of Omaha Beach included Fox Red and Fox Green. Then came Easy Red, followed by Easy Green, Dog Red, Dog White, Dog Green, and Charlie. It was between Vieux-sur-Mer and Saint Laurent at 6:30 in the morning that the first wave of regimental combat teams of the 1st and 29th Divisions were being cut down by a barrage of machine gun fire before they could even step from their landing craft, or within moments after hitting the beach. It was on this tranquil stretch of beach that will forever be known as Bloody Omaha that hundreds of U.S. troops lost their lives in just the first 30 minutes of the invasion. At one end of the beach, a German blockhouse now serves as a monument dedicated to the men of the 467th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. While at the opposite end, a larger casemate stands as graphic testament to the tragic events of June 6, 1944. Sandwiched in between is the Liberation Monument, which commemorates the regimental combat teams of the 1st American and 29th Infantry Divisions, as well as all the Allies who landed on the Normandy coast. Less than a mile away from the dog sectors was the area known as Easy Red, where units of the 1st Infantry Division and 5th Engineers Special Brigade were taking heavy losses as they approached the landing site at 7 a.m., From their concrete trenches overlooking the beach, the Germans unleashed a deadly assault of machine gun fire, which either forced incoming combat units into the water or pinned down the men who had already come ashore. In the meantime, a powerful 75mm cannon was blasting approaching troop carriers out of the water, until it was finally put out of action by early afternoon. The crumbling structure today not only serves as a reminder of the Allied invasion, but as a pedestal for a monument dedicated to the 5th Engineer Special Brigade. Erected shortly after the war, the modest shrine is engraved with the names of the brigade's 106 men who lost their lives during the assault on Easy Red. Just a few feet away is the towering granite obelisk, which honors the fallen soldiers of the 1st American Infantry Division known as the Big Red One. At the nearby American Military Cemetery and Memorial, more than 9,000 marble headstones of Latin crosses and the Star of David bear silent witness to the ultimate sacrifice for freedom. The great Allied crusade known as Operation Overlord continued eastward along the coast of Normandy, with elements of the British Second Army coming ashore at Gold Beach, the Canadian 3rd Infantry arriving at Juno, and the British 3rd Division, supported by specially trained French commandos, landing at Sword. While the 3rd would push inland toward the bridges on the Orne River and Caen Canal, the British 50th on Gold would form a continuous line with the Americans on their left and the Canadians on their right, who came ashore a half-hour later at Juno. The immediate objective for the Canadians arriving at Juno was to form a link with the British on either side, cut off the Caen-Bayeux Road, and then seize the airport west of Caen. Comprised of the 3rd Infantry Division as well as the 7th and 8th Brigades, the Canadians suffered some of the heaviest losses of the Allied forces landing on the beaches of Normandy. It was also at Juno Beach that the soldiers of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada liberated the first house in occupied France. The historic house, which has been in the same family for more than 6 decades, overlooks one of the most scenic and popular vacation sites on the Normandy coast. Today, the Juno Beach landing site is dotted with dozens of reminders of the Allied invasion, such as the imposing Cross of Lorraine monument, which commemorates the return of General de Gaulle on June 14, 1944. Further lining the beachfront is a variety of war relics and monuments, like the 50th anniversary memorial in honor of the Canadian soldiers who died on this beach during the D-Day invasion. The adjacent German blockhouse, which inflicted many of the casualties on the incoming troops, today serves as a monument dedicated to both the British Royal Berkshire Regiment and the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. At the far end of the 5 Allied landing sites was Sword Beach, where the British 3rd Division and French commandos were met with light to moderate resistance as they came ashore at 7:25 in the morning. Tributes to the British 3rd Infantry Division today include the Allied Engineers Memorial, which commemorates their efforts during the early stages of the assault, and the Royal Artillery Monument that recognizes the gallantry of all 5 regiments. In the nearby town of Coville, Montgomery, this uniquely shaped monument, which honors the French commandos, was erected on the exact spot where the first Allied soldiers were killed during the British landing at Sword Beach. On the opposite side of the street, the imposing bronze figure of Bernard Montgomery, whose tempestuous personality nearly led to a fracture in the Allied High Command, invokes the British Field Marshal's important role as commander of the Allied ground forces during the initial phase of the invasion. But through the leadership qualities and political skills of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander of the Expeditionary Forces in Europe, rifts and squabbles in the High Command were kept in check, which ultimately led to the great success of Operation Overlord. Framed by an attractive granite bell-shaped arch, the bronze statue of the man called Ike is one of the most prominent features in the town of Bayeux. Several miles away, in the coastal village of Arromanches, are the remains of the artificial British harbor known as Port Winston. Its haunting ruins today are a perpetual reminder of the incredible events that took place here during the invasion of the Normandy coast. As one of 2 Allied harbors, Port Winston, or Mulberry Bee, consisted of a temporary jetty which was made out of prefabricated concrete caissons that supported steel spans and floating piers. The massive structures were then towed across the entire channel from England in several sections, before they were eventually aligned perpendicular to Gold Beach. A similar harbor called Mulberry was constructed in the American sector at Omaha Beach, but was destroyed during a violent storm in mid-June, making Port Winston the primary site for the unloading of troops, supplies, and heavy armor, until the ports of Cherbourg and Le Havre could be repaired. At about 11 o'clock on the morning of June 6, 1944, thousands of American and British troops were moving inland off the assault beaches and advancing toward their first objectives of Caen, Bayeux, Caratan, and the port city of Cherbourg. But by mid-afternoon, the German 21st Panzer Group was rapidly advancing toward the coast of Normandy, while the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, was driving northward toward the British and the town of Caen. Meanwhile, news of the invasion had forced General Rommel to abruptly end a family vacation and race back to his Western Front headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. Situated on the banks of the Seine about 40 miles northwest of Paris, the magnificent medieval castle became headquarters of Army Group B in February 1944. The chateau's convenient location allowed Rommel to reach the coast of Normandy in a matter of a couple of hours, where he steadfastly believed that the invasion of Fortress Europe would eventually come. While the Duke of the Chateau and his family were relegated to the top floor, Rommel and his staff occupied the first two levels, which included the southern terrace just above the Great Arches. It was in this serene garden, with its picturesque view of the river, that the Field Marshal could often be found meditating prior to joining his guests for dinner in the Petit Salon. The room's rich handcrafted Louis XV paneling and exquisite French marble fireplace also provided for a few extra moments away from the pressures of war. The busiest room in the chateau, however, was the Grand Salon, which not only served as Rommel's office, but as a situation conference room for meetings with the Commander-in-Chief of the West, General Field Marshal von Rundstedt. Their heated debates, sometimes lasting for hours, typically centered around the much-anticipated Allied invasion of Europe. With a military career that spanned more than half a century, it was von Rundstedt that was given the task of building the permanent fortifications of the Atlantic Wall in the summer of 1942. But when Rommel arrived on the scene a year and a half later, he immediately realized that the wall was inadequate and quickly set out to strengthen the entire line of coastal defenses, which included minefields, obstacles, and concrete barriers. But von Rundstedt's failure to place reserves close to the landing beaches helped keep the Germans from driving the Allies back into the sea. On June 17, 1944, Hitler agreed to an emergency meeting with the two men at his Western Front headquarters in northern France. The meeting with von Rundstedt and Rommel would mark the first and only time the Nazi leader would ever visit the French compound. Located several miles north of Soissons near the town of Mageville, the vast complex known as Wolfsglen or Wolfsschlucht II remains the only surviving intact facility used by Hitler as a Fuehrers Hauptquartier. Built between 1943 and 1944 as a command center for the impending Allied invasion, the sprawling headquarters consisted primarily of offices, conference rooms, SS barracks, a cinema hall, power station, military and guest quarters, and subterranean concrete flak bunkers. After the war, several of the concrete structures were modified by the Americans, who then used the facility as a military base until it was taken over by NATO as their European headquarters. When President de Gaulle expelled NATO from the property in 1963, it became a French commando training center, until finally being vacated in the late 1990s. Today, the former Fuehrers Hauptquartier remains isolated and deserted, with no foreseeable plan to revive the decaying complex into a working facility. It was in this building called the Fuhrer Bunker on June 17, 1944, that Rommel informed Hitler that the war was lost, and nothing could be done to stop the Allies from advancing into Germany. At the same time the meeting was taking place at Wolfsschlucht II, the Allied juggernaut was advancing further inland from the assault beaches. While the American 1st Infantry Division and 82nd and 101st Airborne were racing southward towards Saint-Lô, The British 50th and Canadian 3rd were driving eastward toward the city of Caen. On July 14, 1944, Hitler departed the Berghof for his Eastern Front headquarters aboard the specially built train called the Fuehrers Hauptquartiers. Consisting of 15 luxurious coaches, the heavily guarded Fuhrer train included flak wagons, staff and SS personnel cars, a bath and shower car, sleeping and dining coaches, a press corps and conference wagon, and of course Hitler's private Pullman car. The 10-hour-long journey would eventually take the Nazi leader from his beautiful alpine retreat on the Obersalzberg to his mosquito-infested Eastern Front headquarters at Rostenburg. But in spite of its remote East Prussian location, the Fuehrers Hauptquartier near Rostenburg was always the scene of frantic activity. With the arrival of Benito Mussolini on September 15, 1943, it marked the climax of one of the most daring escapes of World War II. It was just 3 days earlier that the deposed dictator had been rescued by a team of SS commandos from a secluded mountaintop retreat in northern Italy. Displaying the flags of both the Alduce and Führer of the Greater German Reich, the Mercedes touring car would make a short 10-minute journey from the Rostenburg airfield to the massive installation known as Wolfsschlucht. As one of 10 major Fuehrers Hauptquartiers situated throughout Europe, Wolfsschanze, or the Wolf's Lair, served primarily as the headquarters during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Occupying more than 2.5 square miles, the enormous complex was comprised primarily of 3 separate security zones, the most important of which was Speerkreis I, location of the Führer bunker, and the concrete shelters of the Inner Circle. Speerkreis II, which included military barracks and housing for important ministers of the Reich, is where the only surviving intact concrete structure can be found today. With its huge 12-foot thick reinforced concrete walls, the Luftschutz, or general-purpose bunker, along with the modest liaison staff office for the Air Force High Command, continues to attract visitors to this historic site year-round. While time and the elements have taken their toll on the decaying staff offices of the Reich's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the barracks of Hitler's escort battalion, the Führerbegleiter, remains relatively intact. The Special Battalion was comprised primarily out of members of the elite Großdeutschland Division. Other notable ruins include the former living quarters of Dr. Engineer Fritz Todt and his successor, architect Albert Speer. The enormously popular Todt not only served as Minister of Armaments, but was also responsible for most of the major building projects throughout the Greater German Reich, including the Autobahn roadway system, the coastal fortifications of the Atlantic Wall, and Hitler's headquarters at Felsenest, Tannenberg, Wolfsschlucht I, and Wolfsschanze. It was from the Rostenburg airfield on the morning of February 8, 1942, that the Reichsminister boarded a specially converted Heinkel 111 for the 2-hour flight back to Berlin. But shortly after takeoff, the plane appeared to momentarily lose power before a large explosion sent the ill-fated plane nose first into the ground. Within a few hours after his death, Albert Speer was appointed Todt's successor in all capacities. The construction of Wolfsschanze began shortly after Hitler gave his final approval in the summer of 1940 and continued throughout the fall of 1944. Speerkreis I, the most heavily fortified of the 3 security zones, consisted of the Führer bunker and the living quarters of other high-ranking Nazis. Other important structures included the communications or telecom bunker and the Situation Conference Barrack, where an assassination attempt nearly took Hitler's life in the summer of 1944. The adjacent Guest bunker, which also served as the Führer's temporary residence during the period of Reconstruction, and the living quarters of Party Secretary Martin Bormann, as well as the Führer bunker, comprised 3 of the largest buildings within the complex. The offices of OKW Chief Wilhelm Keitel and the massive bunker of the Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring are some of the most impressive ruins at the Wolf's Lair today. These huge structures, known as Luftschutz or air raid bunkers, were all dynamited by the German Army Corps of Engineers in January 1945. Directly next door to Goering's bunker was his private living quarters, which consisted of a large oversized parlor, kitchen, and 4 bedrooms. While the bunker of General Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, remains somewhat recognizable, mere rubble barely defines the once sprawling structure of his next-door neighbor, Hitler's adjutant, General Rudolf Schmundt. A few feet away are the massive ruins of the Nachrichten, or telecom bunker, where the communications center and main switchboard were once located. Visiting VIPs like Benito Mussolini and King Boris of Bulgaria were housed here at the guest bunker. But it's the decomposing ruins of the Fuhrer bunker that always draws the most attention. From the beginning of its construction in 1940 until it finally came to an end 4 years later, the Fuhrer bunker gradually reached the enormous size of 120 feet long, 75 feet wide, 30 feet high, and with walls measuring 18 feet thick. When Hitler first took up residency in June 1941, the bunker became the focal point for dozens of strategy meetings. On February 6, 1943, Hitler invited General Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commander of Army Group South in Russia, to meet with OKW's Wilhelm Keitel and Chief of Staff Alfred Jodl so that his plan to recapture the city of Kharkov could be finalized. But despite the plan's overwhelming success, the Field Marshal was eventually relieved of command due to his constant bickering with Hitler. During the period of Reconstruction in 1944, the daily strategy meetings were moved to the little building known as the Lager Barrack. It was here on the afternoon of July 20th, 1944, that Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, the imposing figure on the left, placed a bomb just a few feet away from where Hitler was standing. But incredibly, even though the blast totally devastated the entire building, Hitler was only slightly wounded, while 4 others in the room died from their injuries a few days later. Today, the building's sparse ruins, which includes a large portion of the ceiling and several fragments of the outer walls, serves as a reminder of the day that World War II nearly came to an end. On July 20th, 1992, the anniversary of the event, a bronze plaque was dedicated to the memory of both Klaus von Stauffenberg and the German resistance to Hitler and the Nazis. It was just moments before the 12:43 p.m. blast when von Stauffenberg and his adjutant, Werner von Heftin, promptly made their way from the conference barrack toward the first guard post located outside Speerkreis 1. After a brief delay, they were then allowed to continue along the southern exit road toward the Rostenburg airport. But by the time the 2 men reached the guardhouse at the perimeter of Speerkreis 2, the alarm had already been sounded, and things would not go so easy at the second checkpoint. At first, the guard refused passage, until von Stauffenberg persuaded him to contact the adjutant to the compound commander, who then authorized their clearance. It was between here and the final post that von Heftin tossed a second bomb from the car, which was intended to explode in the conference room along with the first. Checkpoint 3, the final barrier at the outermost reaches of the Wolf Lair, was expected to prove impenetrable. But surprisingly, the would-be assassin and his adjutant were simply waved on through to the Rostenburg airport and freedom. Just 30 minutes after the blast in the conference room, the men were finally airborne and on their way back to their office at Army General Headquarters in Berlin. It was in this building called the Bendler Block that Operation Valkyrie, a covert plan to suppress revolts by foreign slave laborers, was transformed into a secret plot to overthrow the Fuhrer of the Greater German Reich. But when von Stauffenberg's bomb failed to kill Hitler, the plotters in their coup were doomed. By late evening, the offices of the Army High Command, which today houses the German Resistance Memorial Center, was under siege by army units loyal to Hitler. Shortly after midnight, on the 21st of July, von Stauffenberg and 3 of his co-conspirators were marched into this courtyard and executed. Just 12 hours after the attempt on Hitler's life, Colonel Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, his adjutant Lieutenant Werner von Heftin, Colonel Merz von Quernheim, and General Friedrich Olbricht were all summarily gunned down by a firing squad. A 5th man, General Ludwig Beck, was shot moments earlier in his office. Tributes to their memory today include the impressive bronze statue and inscribed commemorative plaque that reads, "You could not endure the shame. You resisted, sacrificing your glowing lives for freedom, justice, and honor." Both the plaque and the life-size statue, symbolizing the resistance fighters to Nazi tyranny, were dedicated on the anniversary of the attempt in July 1953. Within hours after the executions at the Bendler block, hundreds of suspected co-conspirators were rounded up and brought here to Gestapo headquarters, where enemies of the state were often beaten and tortured for days on end. Destroyed during an air raid in February 1945, the only surviving structure of the once infamous building is a portion of the outer wall that surrounded the courtyard, and the rear gate which led to the main jail. In 1987, a large section of the cellar, used by the Gestapo as a storage room, was opened to the public as an exhibition called Topography of Terror. The display not only retraces the history of the building, but the brutal torture methods used by the Gestapo, including those applied to the suspected plotters in the attempt on Hitler's life. For them, a series of mock trials would prove fatal, as most were taken directly from the courtroom to Berlin's notorious Plotzensee Prison. It was in this unassuming little building on August 8, 1944, the same day as the trial, that the first of the condemned men were brought to this room and executed. Over the next couple of weeks, they were followed by two other groups who then suffered the same fate. Escorted by a pair of executioners, each of the condemned men were then hanged by the neck with piano wire, while the entire proceeding was captured on film for the consumption of Adolf Hitler. In all, almost 3,000 people, including 90 of the July 20th plotters, were executed in this death chamber during the Nazi regime. In 1952, one of the building's exterior walls was dedicated as a memorial to the victims of National Socialism. On August 25, 1944, less than 4 months after the landing on the beaches of Normandy, the Allies liberated the city of Paris. 4 days later, the 28th U.S. Infantry Division, who gallantly fought their way through the hedgerows of Normandy, held a huge victory parade down the Champs-Élysées. It would mark the first time in history that U.S. soldiers marched from the parade route and directly into battle. From Paris, the 28th, along with several other U.S. divisions, would race through the French countryside before crossing into Belgium, Luxembourg, and finally Germany. But by mid-September, the weather began to turn bad, and over the next several months, the unit found themselves bogged down under the worst conditions imaginable as they fought their way through the Hürtgen forest. It was here that an estimated 24,000 American soldiers were either captured, killed, or wounded during one of the most fierce land battles of World War II. At about the same time, the Nazi war machine began a massive buildup along the German-Belgian frontier that would ultimately set the stage for the last desperate attempt by Hitler to save his crumbling empire. Today, a Panzer V with its 75mm cannon sits in the Belgian town of Houffalize, a graphic reminder of the deadly events that took place here during the closing months of the war. With its crew of 5, the reinforced steel-plated tank called a Panzerkampfwagen weighed more than 45 tons and represented more than half the total tank strength used by the Germans during the Ardennes Offensive, more commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was in villages and towns like Houffalize where American and German combat units engaged in some of the heaviest fighting of the war along an 85-mile stretch of the German-Belgian frontier. The Nazi battle plan called for the 6th SS Panzer Division to spearhead the attack in the north, while the 5th Panzer Division would push through the center of the American lines, capturing the rail center at Saint-Vite before driving westward. To the south, the 7th Army would advance through Luxembourg, while at the same time acting as a support for the 5th Panzer Army. On December 16, 1944, almost 1,000 tanks and more than 275,000 troops began pouring into Belgium for what the Germans called Watch on the Rhine. Under the leadership of Field Marshal Walter Model, Commander-in-Chief of Army Group B, the Ardennes Offensive included several distinguished battle-hardened commanders, like General Erich Brandenberger of the 7th Army, the brilliant strategist General Hasso von Manteuffel of the 5th Army, and SS General Sepp Dietrich of the 6th SS Panzer Army. It was under Dietrich's command that the elite SS battle group known as Kampfgruppe Piper would forever make the name of Malmedy synonymous with wartime atrocities. On December 17th, as Colonel Piper's unit began advancing toward the town of Malmedy, they were put on a direct collision course with an American truck convoy belonging to Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Battalion. Shortly after turning toward Sanvit, the convoy was spotted by the SS battle group, who then started advancing toward the unsuspecting Americans. Within a matter of minutes, the Germans had succeeded in capturing the entire convoy, and along with several other prisoners taken in an earlier skirmish, they were marched to an open field and lined up in rows of 8. Then, shortly after 2 in the afternoon, a pair of panzers moved into position and opened fire on the unarmed Americans. But sadly, the victims of the Malmedy massacre remained buried beneath a foot of snow for almost a month before efforts to remove the bodies were even attempted. The field near the 5 Points crossroads at Bastogne, where the tragedy actually took place, goes without hardly any notice today. It was on this site near the Crossroads Cafe, where most of the American POWs were first assembled, that a temporary memorial was erected immediately after the war. The marker remained for a number of years until a more permanent monument was constructed on the opposite side of the road in 1949. Shadowed beneath a large cluster of oak trees, the modest memorial is complemented by a sprawling stone wall embedded with 84 bronze plaques engraved with the names of each of the fallen Americans. A few miles south, in the town square of Bastogne, a Sherman M4 is boldly displayed as recognition of the victorious U.S. Army in the Battle of the Bulge. Named in honor of General Anthony McAuliffe, the bustling square not only pays tribute to the American Army, but to the man credited with saving the town from disaster in December 1944. It was McAuliffe, seen here on the right, who was acting division commander when the town became surrounded by 3 German panzer divisions. As headquarters of the 8th Army Corps, Bastogne was being defended by the 101st Airborne Division when it became encircled by the 2nd Panzer Division, Panzerlehr, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, creating a desperate situation. On the morning of the 22nd, the German commander dispatched a messenger with the terms of an unconditional surrender. Within an hour, they received McAuliffe's now famous reply, "Nuts." The following day, the skies over Bastogne seemed miraculously clear, as tons of supplies and equipment were dropped to the embattled troops. There was yet another American hero, General George S. Patton, Jr., who was credited with the rescue of Bastogne when he raced his 4th Armored Division more than 100 miles under the most extreme conditions before reaching the town the day after Christmas. The weapons of choice used by the U.S. Army during the Battle of the Bulge are today showcased at the Bastogne Historical Center. The pristine collection includes the M10 Wolverine tank destroyer with its powerful 76mm gun. Weighing more than 30 tons, the M10 carried a crew of 5 and could reach a speed of nearly 55 miles an hour. A few feet away is the popular all-American favorite, the Sherman M4, with its 105mm howitzer. The Sherman M4 carried a 5-man crew and became the primary armored vehicle used by the U.S. military from the beaches of Normandy and right on into the heart of Germany. One of the museum's more fascinating exhibits is the Heitzer light tank destroyer, which the Germans called the Jagdpanzer 38. During the Ardennes offensive, the Heitzer 75mm cannon was replaced by a deadly flamethrower, which helped camouflage its real purpose. Perched on a nearby hill is the enormous 5-point star-shaped Martisson Memorial, where the Nazi assault on Bastogne finally came to a halt. Built in 1950 by the Belgian people as a gesture of gratitude for the American armed forces, the impressive monument is systematically inscribed with the names of the U.S. divisions who defended their country in the bitter cold month of December 1944. Those who paid the ultimate sacrifice can be found here at the American Military Cemetery and Memorial just outside the city of Luxembourg. The 50-acre site not only contains the remains of thousands of heroic men killed in the Ardennes offensive, but in the fight to cross the Rhine River into Germany. Resting alongside the more than 5,000 troops is the commanding officer of the Third Army, General George S. Patton, Jr. The legendary general died from complications following a freak traffic accident in October 1945. A short distance away is the Deutsche Soldatenfriedhof, the final resting place of nearly 8,000 German soldiers killed during the Ardennes offensive, and in the last desperate attempt to defend their homeland toward the end of the war. In the northern part of Belgium, the victims of the Malmedy massacre, along with thousands of other brave Americans killed in the European theater of war, rest here at the American Military Cemetery and Memorial at Henry-Chapelle. January 1945, the Allies continued crossing the Siegfried Line along the German-Belgian border, advancing ever closer to the Rhine River and the heart of the Third Reich. As American combat units made their way deeper into Germany, they gradually emerged into the picturesque towns and villages of the rolling countryside known as the Eifel, location of one of the three Nazi order castles, Ordensburg Vogelsang. It was on February 4, 1945, when the U.S. 47th Infantry Division passed through its enormous main gate without facing any resistance. Dominated by the imposing tower rising 160 feet, the castle consisted of several important buildings, including the church-like structure known as the Gemeinschaftshaus or Community Center, location of the dining room and honor hall. The centerpiece of the castle was the Adlerhof, where the effects of an Allied air raid can still be seen today by the missing roof of the once covered walkway. The only remaining section of the honor court today is the West Wing, which houses a collection of private quarters and the offices of the commandant and his staff. The attractive breezeway, which connected both wings of the courtyard, led directly to the assembly area. The missing East Wing, destroyed in the air raid of December 1944, consisted of the commandant's office, a barber shop, and the infirmary. Dedicated simultaneously along with Ordensburg, Kreuzensee, and Sonthofen on April 24, 1936, Vogelsang began training the first of Hitler's political soldiers just 1 month after its opening. Perched on a hillside overlooking the Urft River, the castle was designed in a terrace effect with its buildings sloping downward toward the river, while at the same time blending into the natural landscape of the surrounding countryside. With the exception of the damage caused by the air raid, most of the castle today remains in relatively pristine condition. The barracks or Kameradschaftshausen accommodated up to 500 students known as Ordensjunkers, who studied subjects like racial philosophy, Nazi doctrine, and military strategy. But with the outbreak of World War II, the curriculum was abruptly canceled, without anyone ever graduating from the 4-year program. Ranging in age from 23 to 26, the Junkers, who were sent directly from Castle Vogelsang to the front, were replaced in the spring of 1942 by the young members of the Adolf Hitler schools. The boys of the Hitler Youth remained at Vogelsang until the summer of 1944. Today, the barracks are home to both Belgium and Western European forces sent to the castle for special training, which includes various sports activities held on the spacious soccer field. It's here that one of the castle's more interesting exhibits can be found on the monument wall located at the north end of the field. The impressive hand-carved relief, sculptured out of red volcanic rock, showcased a group of ancient athletes participating in a variety of sporting events, including the shot put, javelin, discus, soccer, hurdling, boxing, and hammer throwing. Designed by Willie Mailer in 1936, the carving was destroyed by the U.S. 47th Infantry Division, who used the wall for target practice. On the grounds of the summer solstice, the colossal ruins of the torchbearer, known as the Fagelträger, exemplified the Nazi ideal of the perfect Nordic man. The 20-foot Cape Crusader is accompanied by an inscription that reads, "You are the nation's torchbearer. You carry the light of spirit forward into battle for Adolf Hitler." The missing tiles include the words Torchbearer and Adolf Hitler. Other Nazi relics can be found here at the Adlerhof, where the sprawling East Wing was located prior to the British air raid of December 1944. The stone carvings, each weighing nearly a half a ton, includes the remnants of one of Willie Mailer's twin eagles, found in a nearby town almost 40 years after the war. During the glory years of the Third Reich, the majestic bird stood in tandem with its twin as the centerpiece of the Adlerhof, the castle's court of honor. Today, the bird's partial ruin pales in comparison to yet another of Mailer's works, the former national symbol of the Third Reich. The giant 5-foot bird, which adorned each side of the main entrance, was replaced by the emblem of the Belgian Army a few years after the war. Today, the castle functions as a NATO training center under the direction of the Belgian Army. Following the occupation of Castle Vogelsang in February 1945, U.S. troops continued making their way closer to the Rhine River until finally on March 7th they reached the town of Remagen and the legendary Ludendorff Bridge. Under the command of Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, advance units of the 9th U.S. Armored Division began crossing the 1,000-foot span of the bridge, becoming the first Americans to reach the east bank of the Rhine, the doorstep of the Third Reich. Over the next several days, as thousands of U.S. troops and equipment poured across the river, the Germans made a desperate attempt to bring the great steel structure down with a constant barrage of air attacks and heavy artillery fire. But despite the frantic efforts by the Germans to stop the American advance, an estimated 40,000 troops managed to reach the east bank of the river during a 10-day period of time. But on March 17, 1945, the old bridge finally gave way, taking the lives of 28 men of the U.S. 291st Engineer Battalion who were in the process of strengthening the bridge when it collapsed. But the sacrifice made in the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge not only resulted in thousands of lives being saved, but probably helped shorten the war by at least several weeks. Today, the enormous West Bank towers house a fascinating museum featuring war relics, documents, and rare photographs, tracing the history of the bridge from its completion in 1916 to the present time. The Ludendorff's haunting ruins are protected by German preservation laws, which strictly prohibits their removal or destruction. Dedicated as a memorial to world peace on March 7, 1980, the bridge at Remagen continues to attract thousands of visitors year-round to one of the Second World War's most historic sites. Just a few hundred yards downriver from the Ludendorff was the site of the first U.S. tactical pontoon bridge to cross the Rhine. Built by the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, the 1,100-foot bridge was built in just 32 hours under heavy enemy fire before thousands of troops in armor rolled onto the east bank of the river. At almost the same time, nearly 1 million British troops, led by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, were preparing to cross the river a few miles south. The Allied crossing of the Rhine not only meant that the final push for victory was only weeks away, but that the final chapter of Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was rapidly coming to an end. By early April 1945, the U.S. Army was racing southeastward along the autobahns towards cities like Nuremberg and Munich. Even though the last line of Nazi defenses consisted primarily of young boys and old men who lacked food, supplies, and optimism, they still managed to vigorously defend their fatherland. Meanwhile, as the Allies rolled past the carnage and destruction of one German town after another, the Soviets were liberating dozens of Eastern European cities, while at the same time converging on the German capital. On April 24, 1945, the first several units of the Red Army began entering Berlin en route to their final destination, the seat of the Reich government and the chancellery of Adolf Hitler. Located in the heart of the city on the prestigious Wilhelmstrasse, the old chancellery with its protruding Fuhrer balcony served as Hitler's headquarters from January 1933 until the completion of the new chancellery in 1939. Stretching from the Borsig Palace located on the corner, the new neoclassic structure traversed the entire length of the street from one end to the other. Dedicated on January 10, 1939, The new chancellery was completed in just 9 months by an estimated workforce of more than 4,000 men. Designed by Albert Speer, the grandiose building reflected the new architecture of the 1,000-year Reich. While most visitors gain entry through one of 2 portals located on the Fahrstrasse, dignitaries and diplomats entered through the Eingangstor located adjacent to the Führer balcony on the Wilhelmstrasse. Passing through its enormous double bronze doors, each weighing 1.5 tons, visitors would arrive in a massive open courtyard, which measured the entire length of a football field. Guarded 24 hours a day by an SS honor guard, it was in the Ehrenhof, or Court of Honor, that visitors would get their first sense of the power and grandeur of the Third Reich as they approached the new chancellery. The building's stunning 500-foot marble gallery was designed to humble foreign heads of state as they made their way toward Hitler's office. And as with the Great Hall, the office of the Führer was meant to intimidate visiting diplomats. Measuring almost 4,400 square feet, the richly decorated room was anchored on one end by Hitler's desk, and at the other by the circular seating area where most official talks took place. But it was the monumental mosaic gallery, with its exalted and mystical aura, that distinguished it as the busiest room in the new chancellery. Used primarily for the funerals of important Nazi leaders and special events, the room was filled to capacity in May 1942 as dozens of workers were decorated for their outstanding service by Armaments Minister Albert Speer and the Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring. But it's highly unlikely that either Göring or Speer could have ever imagined that on May 5, 1945, exactly 3 years to the day from the armaments ceremony, that Soviet KGB chief Laurent Beria would be making his entrance into what remained of the Reichs Chancellery. While the marble gallery had been plundered of its lavish furnishings, and the defiant red marble walls of the mosaic gallery stood firm, Hitler's office was transformed into an austere shell. From the garden entrance of Hitler's office, the KGB chief and his entourage made their way to the Führer bunker located directly behind the old chancellery. Buried more than 50 feet below the chancellery garden, the underground concrete fortress was comprised of 2 separate bunkers that together measured 170 feet long and more than 150 feet wide. Connected by a rectangular stairwell, the upper or fore bunker, completed in 1936, housed the staff and SS personnel quarters, kitchens, pantry, wine cellar, boiler room, and the living quarters of the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and his family. The lower or Führer bunker, built in 1944, consisted of massive concrete walls measuring 13 feet thick and housed the switchboard, doctor's office, conference room, the office of the Führer, and the living quarters of Adolf Hitler and his wife, Eva Braun. It was here that the newly married couple committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. Today, the remains of the Führer bunker lie directly below a parking lot of an apartment complex on the grounds of the former chancellery. From the emergency exit of the bunker, the KGB chief then made his way past the garden entrance of Hitler's office and toward the ornamental pool where the only intact surviving bunker of the new Reichs Chancellery lies buried today. Located 50 feet below an island of dirt which was once flanked on both sides by the infamous Berlin Wall, the Chancellery bunker was uncovered for the first time in over 6 decades while workers searched for unexploded landmines in the area formerly known as the Death Strip. At about the same time, workers also discovered a nearby SS bunker that still contained weapons, uniforms, and a colorful display of wall murals. As of today, the city of Berlin has insisted that both bunkers remain sealed and completely inaccessible, using the excuse that they might become neo-Nazi shrines. It was here in the Chancellery bunker that Hitler could often be found gazing at an oversized display containing a model of the new city of Linz, his hometown in Austria. This amateur video, taken in June 1992 during a series of archaeological measurements, captures what is perhaps the best evidence of how the Führer bunker might have looked, since the two were almost exactly the same in design. Surrounded by reinforced concrete walls and covered by a blanket of water 2 feet deep, the gargantuan bunker measures nearly 500 feet long and almost 300 feet wide, and represents the only surviving structure of Albert Speer's new Reichs Chancellery. In addition to a field hospital, canteen, conference room, generator and ventilation plant, communications room, living quarters for both civilian and military personnel, the bunker also consisted of a very large laundry and shower area called the Wasch- und Brauseraum. Prior to the bunker being sealed for the first time in the summer of 1946, Allied military personnel and civilians stripped the place of everything that wasn't fastened down, including office equipment, furniture, carpets, paintings, cooking utensils, an empty safe, and even the majority of tile that once lined the shower walls. On May 2, 1945, the commander of Berlin, General Helmut Wilding, and his staff emerged from this bunker and onto the Fahrstrasse, only to be taken prisoner by the Soviets. A few days later, the men were forced to reenact their surrender for the benefit and enjoyment of the Russian people. Devastated by Allied bombs, the ruins of the new Chancellery remained standing until the spring of 1949, when they were finally razed to the ground by order of the Soviet government. The street where the heart of the Third Reich took its last desperate beat goes without hardly any notice today. At the opposite end of the street, where the new Chancellery joined with the old, the once revered site is now occupied by a modern apartment complex. But traces of the new Chancellery can still be found at various locations throughout the city, like the Soviet War Memorial at Treptow Park. Overlooking the mass grave of an estimated 5,000 troops is the towering bronze figure of a Russian soldier clutching a German child while plunging his sword into a Nazi swastika. Lining each side of the park is a collection of striking high-definition reliefs depicting the final battle for Berlin, which were carved out of sections of limestone from the front facade of the new Chancellery. Flanking the entrance of the park is a set of giant marble flags, each showcasing a bronze Soviet soldier kneeling in solemn homage to his fallen comrades. The red marble used for both the flag monuments and the walkway surrounding the park came directly from the giant mosaic gallery of the new Chancellery. In addition to the Soviet memorial at Treptow Park, another monument near the Brandenburg Gate is the final resting place for more than 2,500 Soviet soldiers. Completed in late 1945, the impressive structure was also built from the marble and granite materials salvaged from the new Chancellery. Despite Soviet efforts to erase any trace of Hitler's Third Reich, several former Nazi government buildings have managed to survive, including Hermann Göring's Air Ministry headquarters, which today houses Germany's finance department. And just a block away, the one-time Nazi propaganda ministry is now the Department of Labor. In Munich, the former Fuhrer building functions as a music school, while the German House of Art continues as a world-class gallery. But for the most part, little remains of these colossal structures that once symbolized the power and glory of the Third Reich. As these massive ruins of concrete and rubble fade with time, the legacy of the Nazi regime will forever endure in the pages of history.